Like something straight out of the cyberpunk genre Gibson pioneered. It's currently 2020, and the COVID-19 quarantine has seen widespread closings of all non-essential businesses. A major shift to cyberspace for large segments of the population has helped to highlight economic instability present in our system, as treatment is influenced by class, and technological advancement is slowed to benefit corrupt officials and slimy businessmen. There's little doubt that we're seeing a reshaping of the views around work and the function of society, as well as the obsolete infrastructure holding it all in place. It's becoming increasingly evident that many facets of life are just houses of cards, and the way the internet works in the US is a particularly flimsy one. While employers and educators alike have mandated that people work or attend school from home, many are realizing that there's just a huge constraint on this, as large segments of the population have been hitting this digital divide when it comes to internet access. Some streaming services like YouTube have lowered their default quality in hopes of alleviating this data traffic jam. We're definitely still made aware of our internet's weaknesses as a whole. With an increasing number of students receiving homework assignments that have an online component, a lack of internet can be a huge barrier. While some students can sometimes go to a library to get around this, or is more often the case, a Starbucks or McDonald's that has free public Wi-Fi in order to do their homework, the quarantine has rendered this impossible right now. One solution has been to send out school buses with wireless hotspots to locations that don't have internet. But this solution is temporary and not sustainable at all. Another option is to use cellular data, which more often than not is the only option for a lot of low-income households. However, this is the least efficient and most expensive option due to data caps and overage fees. In response to this crisis, FCC Chairman Ajit Pai begged telecom companies to sign up for his Keep America Connected pledge. This is a good start, but more should be done to increase the bandwidth of consumers, who are now unexpectedly forced to put added stress on their home network connections just to get by remotely close to like they normally would. However, since repealing net neutrality, there's little the FCC can do since they abdicated their legal responsibility by changing internet services to information services, which they aren't responsible for, instead of telecommunication services, which they would be, meaning they could mandate a change, but they can't. Now they can only ask telecoms to do something. Politely. Additionally, had Ajit Pai not made it his personal mission to gut the Lifeline program that provided discounted internet to low-income households, there would be more organizational support in place to help households in need of connections but lacking in resources. Under the guise of fighting corruption and fraud, Pai put in place numerous hurdles to make it harder for people to apply for Lifeline, while also putting a hard cap on the budget. At the same time, he promoted agency-wide belt-tightening and fought expansion to new households. Currently, the subsidy is less than $10, limited to one device, and without standards to measure quality. In other words, it's consistent with the rest of Ajit Pai's approach, where he pays lip service to a real issue while delivering results that could be best described as a cruel mockery to the recipients. While credit's due to AT&T for removing their data caps and Comcast for their free internet service for low-income households, considering they didn't have to do anything, the FCC said, we can't forget that these are also the same companies that lobbied to kill net neutrality while price gouging, or, in many instances, held American innovation hostage for their own bottom line. It's great that they've worked to help people out in this difficult time. But it's also worth pointing out that if we had fiber to the home as a standard, we'd be weathering the storm a lot better than we currently are. Net neutrality's repeal was terrible, but it's just a bump in the road. It's a symptom of a non-competitive system designed to extract as much taxpayer money to preserve market share regardless of the cost to its customer base. If you're an American, there's a very high likelihood that your internet sucks, and there's no piece of reasonably priced equipment or service that you can get to completely fix it. It's expensive, probably slow, and if you're in large swaths of the United States, it's probably altogether impossible to get, at least within reasonable means. So why was the FCC's proposal for the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund opposed? The fund would use government subsidies rolled out over the next decade to beef up the nation's rural broadband capabilities. Seems like it would have bipartisan support, right? After all, the song America the Beautiful basically reads like a laundry list of why it's difficult to deliver any service in the United States. Mountains, large open swaths of land, and wilderness would all pose a challenge for getting people what they need, whether it's electricity then or internet now. In her partial dissent to the proposed fund, FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel stated, "Right now, if a single subscriber in a census block is identified as having broadband, we conclude broadband is available throughout. That's not right. And that's so many people who are unserved and erroneously suggest that our broadband efforts are done. The FCC should know in detail where service truly is and where it is not. It should be that we figure this out before sending federal funds to who knows where to build who knows what. But that is not what we do today. We rush billions of dollars out the door in what feels like a broadband publicity stunt. A lack of specificity in how territory is covered means that if one person has obtained broadband in that entire census block, it's listed as being covered. Census blocks are often bounded by geographical features or invisible boundaries and change based on census results. They're meant to be the smallest level of geography for getting demographic data, but they're not the best way to measure internet speeds. A census block can vary wildly and be a few streets in a large population center or several hundreds of miles in large spaces like in Alaska. Additionally, a territory is considered to be served by broadband if just one person in that territory has it under FCC's Form 477. The FCC's fixed deployment map uses this data, which is released twice a year, to provide a supposedly up-to-date view of a number of the services in a given area. But this data is often overstated in terms of both the options available and the speed of them, since the FCC doesn't actually audit them. This would be like if when you got your driver's license, they just looked at your log and were like, well, looks like you wrote down enough time, guess we'll just give you the license. Having you get behind the wheel just seems redundant. Without verification, saying this means nothing is giving the FCC too much credit. When the FCC does choose to measure internet speeds, there's also some further fudging of numbers. To measure speeds, the FCC sends out what are called white boxes, or off-the-shelf routers that run pre-installed software to measure things like download speed, upload speed, and latency. According to a recent Wall Street Journal report, telecoms essentially know where tests will take place and then use a number of things in their power to game the system. For one, internet providers are able to spot when a test is taking place and can free up bandwidth for that area during that time to provide speeds higher than would typically be seen in that area. The FCC even knows this is a problem, finding that measured download speeds are 100% or better during peak hours. And yet this enhancement is ignored because it provides the desired numbers. In addition to this, the report stated the FCC can be persuaded by companies to remove data they find disagreeable, blaming faulty equipment or excluding days when there's heavy traffic, like a football game or even a big software update. The reason for a deletion isn't necessarily even included in their reports either. As luck would have it, there's a bill on the president's desk to address just this. Senate Bill 1822, aka the Broadband Deployment Accuracy and Technological Availability Act, attempts to improve the way the FCC collects, verifies, and then reports its data by creating the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric, a dataset of geocoded information for all broadband service locations. In addition to this, the FCC would have to create a challenge process for independent verification of its maps. Were this to pass, it would help to fight the corporate cheating the FCC has chosen to facilitate in the past. With its naked acceptance of influence, the FCC has chosen to adopt cable companies' business plans as their own, sacrificing the futures and livelihoods of rural and low-income communities in the process. Web browsing and streaming are one-sided activities when it comes to data transmission. Without setting a standard of reciprocal download and upload speeds, telecoms are cutting people off from telemedicine opportunities, job opportunities, and a number of other things, but you wouldn't know that based on the gaslighting they've employed in their strategy. Following the repeal of net neutrality, Ajit Pai released a glib-as-hell PSA with 280,000 dislikes versus 11,000 likes. The point of this PSA was to let you know you could still do everything you did before, but now with the freedom to get gouged by telecoms unfettered by petty regulations. This is smug as hell, considering how many Americans are cut off from services they didn't even realize they could have. With coronavirus, there's numerous people working from home. However, if they do a teleconference, they might find their connection lacking. There's also no question telemedicine would help to mitigate the overall effect. But Verizon and Comcast are primarily focused on content delivery, so there's no reason for them to invest in infrastructure that doesn't support those ends. With a robust internet connection, we could deliver services much more efficiently and in a cost-effective manner that would benefit everyone in the system. In rural areas, physicians could see a larger number of people who would also benefit from a more convenient and cost-effective option than an in-person visit that might take up a better part of their day when one factors in transportation. In Oregon, grants from the Office of Rural Health were used to have dental hygienists visit remote communities where dental services were a rarity. Working in tandem with dentists in Portland, they were able to perform exams and give patients scoop and fill cavity fillings. This allowed people outside of Portland to receive necessary services while also freeing up time for the dentist to focus on other operations in Portland that might require more attention or equipment to treat. In places where telemedicine is present, people are able to have quicker, more convenient, and cheaper doctor's visits, limiting in-person visits to those that are absolutely necessary, while providing the same level of care in a way that better meshes with the patient's life and schedule. Teletherapy is also vital for places that might be underserved by mental health professionals, while also removing barriers for people seeking treatment. If we can make it easier for people to receive treatment due to there being less of a stigma of a video call and lower the costs, we could vastly improve the quality of life for Americans in ways that they haven't seen before. However, we're going to have to make sure that a reciprocal high-speed connection is in place for any of these to work. Recognizing our cost savings as well as quality of life improvements with telemedicine, Montana attempted to reach its remote constituents in 2017 with a bill attempting to expand these services. But the bill died due to the lack of sufficient connections for such a program. During that same year that Montana was having its broadband aspirations meet its low-speed reality, Ajit Pai attempted to improve the FCC's perceived success by lowering the bar for the speed of broadband. In the first ever proposed reduction of speed, FCC suggested that the growing prevalence of cellular networks meant that less speed was required for a fixed connection, and thus the definition of broadband could be changed. In her book Fiber, Susan Crawford described the situation like so. By including DSL connections and smartphone access in its calculations, lowering the threshold for what constitutes a high-speed connection from the FCC's current 25 megabits per second down to just 3 megabits per second, and assuming that all these connections are suitable from the customer's perspectives, the Cable Association felt able to claim that most Americans have choices for high-speed internet access. But the reality is that at that 25 megabits per second level, far worse than what's common in much of Asia and Northern Europe, most Americans have at most one option for residential internet access. Out of 118 million U.S. households, almost 11 million can't buy wired internet access service with this capacity at any price, and about 46 million households live in places that have just one provider. The problem with this idea is its purposeful misrepresentation to make it seem like the goal is being accomplished, like if you got an F on a test but used a marker to change it into a B. By including cell phone usage, Pai and the FCC are attempting to inflate the numbers for broadband adoption and hide how bad data connections are throughout the US. Claiming cell phones, which again are the least efficient and most expensive option, often used as a sole connection source out of necessity, is not a viable substitute for an internet connection. Redefining the terms of success so your failure doesn't sting as much is arguably the least effective way to achieve a goal, and that's more or less what's taking place here. Frustratingly, fiber optic cables are already in place and form the backbone of most of our telecommunication systems, with long haul running between cities and middle mile or business data service lines running into metro areas. Last mile is the weakest link, acting as a bottleneck since it's the only part not using fiber in the US, instead using coax cable. Fiber optic cables use strands of high purity glass encased in cladding and plastic in order to maximize reflectivity and protection. These cables act as a highway for transmissions converted into beams of light in a technology that sounds fairly futuristic but in reality has been around for decades. Often called dark fiber, this untapped resource is basically a metaphor for our fiber future in the fact that we have a resource that is currently untapped but is very within reach. For a quick comparison, South Korea, Japan, and Singapore all have almost 100% fiber, and upgrades began about 30 years ago. China installs about 20,000 new home fiber connections daily, while the European Commission has also developed plans and strategies to achieve their European Gigabit Society. At the same time, Japan also released a 10 gigabits per second internet connection plan for just $55 a month. While the FCC and telecoms are working together to try and convince us that fiber isn't necessary, most of the world is actually passing us by. For internet experts, this is basically that one meme where they're asking for fiber broadband and the FCC has that mom saying that we have it at home, while in reality, we have cable, or even worse, DSL. Over-reliance on private market competition for infrastructure deployment in the US has been a persistent bad idea that continues today. In 2002, when acting FCC Chairman Michael Powell deregulated the information transport industry, he believed that competition would lead to higher connection speeds for everyone, as companies would try to top each other with a variety of cutting-edge tech. He believed that DSL would take on cable, which would take on satellite, with wireless covering everything in between. However, shortly thereafter, there were a number of mergers and consolidations that occurred, but not really the competitions or the high speeds. The belief that different transmission methods would be able to compete is proven inaccurate, as DSL speeds have lagged behind the ones delivered by cable, while more applications have grown to demand a higher bandwidth. DSL has also taken a nosedive in popularity, driving an increasing number of internet users to purchase cable broadband subscriptions. Fios, or Verizon's fiber internet service, only reaches about 14% of Americans, and rollout stopped in 2010 as Verizon can't justify installations to their shareholders due to the fact that it already has a network of twisted copper wire in place, and that in order to install a fiber optic network like they have with Fios would require upgrades to what's already in place. Build-outs ended in 2015, and while you can still subscribe to service if you're in its territory, they aren't expanding to new ones. While increasing the number of fiber subscribers would bring in more revenue, digging up pavement and running fiber optic wire is seen as steep investment when they already have their obsolete DSL infrastructure in place and little incentive to improve in the first place. When my girlfriend and I were looking at houses a few years ago, the one we ended up buying had been abandoned for about a year. It needed the entire first floor's joists replaced. Having some background on this, I realized how daunting it would be to get a fiber connection, and we ended up going with the house because we realized that it would be more taxing to have a fiber line put in than to have all the work that needed to be done taken care of. Calling DSL and cable obsolete isn't overhyping fiber at all either. Fiber functions significantly better due to a scientific principle called the Shannon limit. The presence of the word blog in this formula shut my brain down for a second when I first saw it because... So let's just drop it and focus on the relationship it outlines instead. The Shannon limit expresses the overall capacity of a channel and relates to bandwidth and the signal-to-noise ratio. In simpler terms, the better the bandwidth, the better the overall capacity of a transmission, and the more noise that is present, the less capacity there will be. A signal's power also decreases the longer it has to travel, so the signal-to-noise ratio also decreases the longer distances get. While cable is able to support higher download speeds than DSL, they both pale in comparison to fiber's reciprocal download-upload speeds, which are necessary for anything involving two-way video. Cable broadband is a sufficient medium if your traffic is mostly one way, like browsing websites or streaming video. But once you start sending data back with something like a teleconference, you become acutely aware of cable's limitations. With cable's lower bandwidth and higher error rates, latency can result due to delays coming about from encoding and decoding in order to correct that interference. Fiber, on the other hand, has a higher bandwidth and lower error rates. While it is sometimes possible to get similar speeds to fiber with cable, those are often in ideal and not real-world conditions and would require the installation of a larger number of cable nodes and other installation projects to provide a similar speed as a 1 gigabit fiber line than anyone is really going to do. Fiber optic cables also tend to last much longer than coax cables, and system-wide upgrades are much easier to implement, with the electronics on one end only needing to be replaced compared to serious construction projects with other mediums. Instead of providing connection speeds like those Americans would need for working remotely or for potential uses like telemedicine, Verizon has chosen to give up on broadband and focus on being a wireless provider, which serves to complement a Comcast subscription instead of actually providing a viable alternative. In 2011, this was put out in the open when Verizon negotiated a transfer of wireless spectrum with Comcast for $3.6 billion, despite the protests of a number of smaller competitors in that space, including T-Mobile, who, in a sign of how much consolidation exists with telecoms, has recently merged with Sprint. In the ensuing decade, the cable provider has become the only available option for internet service for a majority of Americans, mostly due to territorial monopolies, or agreements for two companies not to compete in each other's particular territories, who's absorbed smaller and failing cable companies and rolled them into their operations like some giant amorphous blob, clustering them together geographically in order to dominate by scale, focusing on the most lucrative urban markets while leaving the more rural areas in the dark. Without competition, there's no incentive to upgrade, because who else is their customer base going to buy from? This does pose a problem though, since increasing revenues is always a goal. Comcast's strategy to still provide returns lies in upselling other services, or adding fees to existing customers, even if it's not anything they ever requested, and it happens without their knowledge when it does occur. AT&T appears to be following a similar route with its absorption of DirecTV and Time Warner in its attempt to compete with Comcast in the TV market, where their $157 million investment has helped them gain 4.1 million fewer customers in just 2019. 2017 also saw AT&T tout the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act as a boon to telecoms and consumers alike, since as AT&T Randall Stevenson said at the time via press release, research, and I'm not sure where this research is from, since the press release didn't really provide any citations. So I guess Stevenson, could have just made it up. So research tells us that every $1 billion in capital invested in telecom creates about 7,000 good jobs for the middle class. Well, instead, they created negative 37,818 jobs and saw investments in their network drop to the lowest levels in a decade, demonstrating that the larger these entities get, the worse they become at employing people and maintaining their equipment. At CES 2020, FCC Chair Ajit Pai suggested that 5G could be a valuable tool in bridging the rural divide by building off of Microsoft's Airband proposal, which utilized so-called white spaces, or unclaimed real estate used with TV channels, as well as taking over existing spectrum currently utilized by automakers and utility providers. In addition to this, he encouraged other innovative solutions, whatever the hell that means. 5G is the fifth generation of wireless technology currently being deployed that you might have heard some conspiracy theories about. It builds off the existing 4G infrastructure but provides a much stronger signal by way of a small cell signal, or a high-powered antenna that is much more able to deliver a much more focused signal than what's currently available, meaning the network can handle data at a much more faster rate. And no, it does not give you COVID-19. I'm going to go into further detail in a later video, but for this situation, this is all you really need to know. When 5G is brought up in the context of rural America, it's brought up as a magical solution that's going to sidestep the whole connection issue. But this is a cop-out if I've ever seen one, since any 5G network, or wireless network that a city might put in place for that matter, is only as strong as its backbone. If a 5G cell site is going to have enough bandwidth to support anything coming down the pipeline, it's going to need a connection capable of carrying the flood of data it's going to receive. Fiber feeding into 5G is the only real method to do what Pi is promising, so this is effectively gaslighting. This topic actually relates to today's sponsor. Today's sponsor is Gaslight. Do you love a beverage that won't fill you up or satisfy your thirst? Do you love presumptive lines of questioning? Do you love being told what you love in a patronizing tone from a disembodied, overtly masculine voice? From the makers of green soda, it's Gaslight, with more of the refreshing CO2 that we know you love, because we've told you that you love it through persistent, penetrating ad campaigns. Finally, a drink with the rich taste of air without any of the liquid or calories clogging up your gut. So kick up your feet, knock up a bottle or back or up or down or however the physics of that would work. This ain't your grandmother's no-calorie sody pop. I never said it was. You're just misremembering it. You totally don't get what I'm saying here. Just don't get hysterical, okay? I'm sorry that's what you think I said. I can't talk to you when you get all emotional like this. Just drink Gaslight, okay? With Gaslight, you have what you need, alright? In order to understand how the telecommunications industry ended up being devoured by a few giants, it helps to have a historical context to fully understand how we got here, and to also see how countries have ended up with better internet that costs less. Like and subscribe if you want to find out how a solution from America's past might be the key to its future. In the meantime, tell us some of your horror stories of getting internet services from some of the companies I've mentioned. Until then, take care, and I hope to see you again.